The morning sun was just starting to rise when Harold Thompson woke up at exactly 6 o'clock a.m. At 93 years old, he still followed the same routine he had kept since his military days. His small but neat house on Oak Street was quiet, just as it had been since his dear wife Mary passed away 5 years ago. Harold slowly got out of bed and walked to the bathroom. His steps were careful but steady. In the mirror, he saw an old face with kind blue eyes looking back at him. His white hair was thin, but always well combed, and despite his age, he stood straight and tall. Every morning, he would put on his clean, pressed clothes and his special veteran's cap that showed he had served in World War II. The old veteran lived alone, but he wasn't lonely. His house walls were covered with photos that told the story of his life. There were pictures of him in his military uniform when he was young, standing proud and strong. Next to those were photos of his wedding day with Mary, their 2 children who now lived in different states, and their 5 grandchildren. Each picture held a special memory that made him smile. Harold's morning routine was simple but important to him. He would make his bed with perfect hospital corners, just like he learned in the army. Then he would walk to his small kitchen, where everything was organized and in its right place. He made himself a cup of black coffee and 2 pieces of toast with butter. While eating, he would read yesterday's newspaper that his neighbor Jimmy, a 12-year-old boy, would bring him every evening after school. Every Thursday was special for Harold. It was the day he would drive to Pete's Diner for breakfast, a tradition he had kept for 20 years. He would take his well-maintained 1985 Cadillac, which he kept as clean and shiny as the day he bought it. The car was his pride and joy, a reminder of the good times he had shared with Mary. That particular Thursday started like any other. Harold put on his favorite blue sweater, his comfortable brown pants, and his veteran's cap. He checked himself in the mirror one last time, making sure his appearance was neat and proper. The weather outside was nice, a crisp autumn morning with leaves turning golden and red. As Harold walked to his garage, he noticed his young neighbor Jimmy collecting the morning newspaper from his driveway. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," Jimmy called out, waving with a big smile. Harold waved back, remembering how Jimmy always listened to his old war stories with wide-eyed interest. The boy reminded him of himself when he was young, curious, and full of energy. The Cadillac's engine started smoothly, just as it always did. Harold backed out of his driveway carefully, checking all his mirrors twice. He had never had an accident in his life, and he wasn't planning to start now. The drive to Pete's Diner usually took exactly 12 minutes, and Harold enjoyed every moment of it. He would pass by the park where children played, the old library where he used to take his kids, and the post office where he had worked after the war. What Harold didn't know was that this Thursday would be different from all the others. As he drove, his mind wandered to the past, thinking about his time in military intelligence during the war. He had been trained for special operations, taught how to think quickly in dangerous situations, and how to stay calm when things got tough. Those skills had saved his life many times during the war, but he never thought he would need them again, especially not at Pete's Diner. The morning was peaceful, the traffic was light, and everything seemed normal. But as Harold pulled into the diner's parking lot, he noticed something unusual. 3 large motorcycles were parked in his regular spot, and their owners were watching him through the diner's window. Something about their faces made his old military instincts stir to life. Harold looked at the 3 motorcycles in his usual parking spot and felt something wasn't right. The bikes were big and black, covered in chrome that sparkled in the morning sun. Each one had a scary-looking symbol painted on it, a red skull with burning eyes. He parked his Cadillac in a different spot, taking his time to make sure it was perfectly straight between the white lines. As he stepped out of his car, Harold could feel the bikers watching him through the diner's big front window. They were 3 large men dressed in black leather jackets. The biggest one had tattoos all over his neck, and he was smiling in a way that made Harold remember the bad guys he had dealt with during the war. Pete's Diner was usually a friendly place. The bell above the door would ring when customers walked in, and the smell of fresh coffee and bacon would fill the air. But today, when Harold opened the door, something felt different. The usual morning customers were there, Mrs. Wilson drinking her tea, Mr. Martinez reading his newspaper, and Sally the waitress carrying plates of hot food. But everyone seemed quieter than normal, and their eyes kept moving toward the corner where the 3 bikers sat. "Good morning, Harold," Sally called out, trying to sound cheerful. She was a kind woman in her 50s who had been serving Harold his breakfast for many years. "Your usual table is taken today. How about sitting at the counter?" But before Harold could answer, One of the bikers spoke up. "Hey, old-timer," he called out in a loud voice that made everyone in the diner look down at their plates. "Why don't you join us? We got your special seat right here." The other two bikers laughed, and their leader, the one with neck tattoos, pulled out a chair with a loud scraping noise. Harold stood straight and tall, just like he had been trained to do when facing danger. He could see that these men were trouble, but his military training had taught him to stay calm and think clearly. He watched as the three men exchanged looks and ugly smiles. The biggest biker, who had a name tag on his jacket that read Snake, stood up. He was much taller than Harold and probably weighed twice as much. "What's the matter, Grandpa? Don't you want to sit with us?" Snake asked, walking closer to Harold. His heavy boots made loud thuds on the diner's floor. Sally tried to step between them. "Now, listen here," she started to say, but Snake's friend, a man with a long beard, held up his hand to stop her. The whole diner had gone completely quiet. Even the cook, Big Joe, had stopped making noise in the kitchen and was watching through the serving window. Harold noticed everything around him, just like he used to do in his intelligence training. He saw that Snake had a slight limp in his left leg. The second biker kept his right hand in his pocket, and the third one stayed close to the window, watching the parking lot. Harold also noticed that the diner's phone was just a few steps away, and the kitchen had a back door that led to the alley. "That's quite a fancy hat you got there," Snake said, reaching for Harold's veteran's cap. "Mind if I try it on?" His fingers were just inches from the cap that Harold had worn proudly for so many years, the cap that reminded him of all his friends who hadn't made it home from the war. The other customers in the diner watched in fear. Mrs. Wilson had her hands over her mouth, and Mr. Martinez had put down his newspaper, his coffee forgotten. Even the morning sun seemed to dim as clouds passed outside, casting dark shadows through the diner's windows. Harold knew he had to make a decision. At 93 years old, he wasn't as strong as he used to be, but his mind was still sharp. As Snake's hand moved closer to his cap, Harold remembered something his commanding officer had told him long ago. Sometimes the best fight is the one you don't have to throw a punch in. Just as Snake's fingers were about to touch Harold's veteran cap, the old man took one smooth step backward. The movement was so graceful that it surprised everyone in the diner. Snake's hand grabbed empty air, and he almost lost his balance. "My cap stays where it is," Harold said in a calm, clear voice. His words weren't loud, but they carried across the quiet diner like a strong wind. Some of the customers who knew Harold had never heard him speak this way before. His voice had changed from that of a friendly old man to someone who had commanded troops. Snake's face turned red with anger. He wasn't used to people standing up to him, especially not old men. "Listen here, old-timer," he growled, moving closer to Harold. "Maybe you don't understand how things work. When I want something, I take it." His two friends stood up and moved to stand behind him, trying to make themselves look bigger and scarier. Harold didn't move. His blue eyes stayed steady as he looked at the three men. He remembered facing worse situations in the war, times when he had to outsmart enemies who were stronger and better armed. These bikers were bullies, but they weren't soldiers. The biker with the long beard, who called himself Razor, reached over and knocked Harold's coffee cup off the table. Hot coffee spilled across the floor, and the cup broke with a loud crash. "Oops," Razor said with an ugly laugh. "Looks like you made a mess, old man." Sally, the waitress, started forward with a cloth to clean up the spill, but Snake blocked her path. "Let Grandpa clean it up," he said. "He needs to learn some manners." The third biker, a man with a shaved head who everyone called Tank, moved to block the diner's front door. Some of the customers wanted to help Harold, but they were afraid of getting hurt. Mrs. Wilson was quietly crying at her table, and Mr. Martinez had his phone out under the table, probably calling the police. Harold looked at the broken cup on the floor, then back at Snake. In his mind, he was already planning 3 different ways to handle this situation. His military training had taught him to always think ahead, to look for advantages others might miss. He noticed that the kitchen door was still open, that Big Joe the cook was holding a heavy frying pan, and that Tank wasn't watching the diner's back entrance. "You boys think you're pretty tough," Harold said, his voice still calm. "Picking on an old man, breaking things that aren't yours, scaring nice people who just want to eat their breakfast in peace." He straightened his back, and somehow, even though he was shorter than the bikers, he seemed to grow taller. Snake didn't like the way Harold was talking to him. He reached out again, faster this time, and grabbed Harold's arm. His grip was strong enough to leave bruises, but Harold didn't show any pain on his face. Instead, he looked Snake directly in the eyes. "Last chance, old man," Snake said through clenched teeth. "Give me the cap, and maybe we'll let you walk out of here without help." His friends laughed at this threat, and Tank cracked his knuckles loudly. The morning sun had fully risen now, shining through the diner's windows and casting long shadows across the floor. Harold could see his reflection in the chrome napkin holder on the counter. He saw an old man, yes, but also a soldier who had survived worse things than 3 bullies in a diner. Snake's grip on Harold's arm tightened, and he reached for the veteran's cap again. But something in Harold's eyes made him hesitate for just a moment. Maybe it was the way the old man stood without fear, or maybe it was the strange half-smile that had appeared on Harold's face. What happened next would be talked about in Pete's Diner for years to come. In the tense silence of Pete's Diner, Harold's mind flashed back to his military training from 50 years ago. He remembered his instructor, Sergeant Miller, teaching him how to handle dangerous situations. "Your mind is your strongest weapon," the sergeant had said. "When you're in trouble, think first, then act." Snake's grip was still tight on Harold's arm, but the old veteran didn't struggle. Instead, he slowly reached into his pocket with his free hand. This simple movement made all 3 bikers suddenly nervous. They watched his hand carefully, not knowing what to expect. What Harold pulled out was just a clean white handkerchief. "Excuse me," he said politely, "but you spilled some coffee on your boot." Snake automatically looked down at his feet, loosening his grip just a little. It was a trick Harold had learned long ago. Make your opponent look away for just a second. In that brief moment, Harold gently twisted his arm in a special way, and suddenly Snake's strong grip meant nothing. The big biker found himself holding empty air, while Harold had stepped smoothly to one side. It happened so quickly and quietly that some people in the diner almost missed it. "How did you?" Snake started to say, his face showing surprise and anger. He wasn't used to people, especially old people, slipping away from him so easily. His friends, Razor and Tank, looked just as confused. Harold stood calmly by the counter now, his veteran's cap still perfectly straight on his head. "In the war," he said in his quiet voice, "I learned that strength isn't everything. Sometimes knowing how to move is more important than knowing how to fight." The customers in the diner watched with wide eyes. They saw how Harold, despite his age, stood straight and confident. His movements were smooth and careful, like a dancer who knew every step by heart. Even Sally, the waitress, had stopped worrying for a moment, surprised by how different Harold looked. Snake's face turned red with embarrassment. "Get him," he ordered his friends, but as Razor and Tank moved forward, Harold did something unexpected. He smiled and sat down at the counter, turning his back to them. This confused the bikers even more. Nobody had ever just turned their back on them before. They didn't know that Harold had positioned himself perfectly. The counter's mirror let him see everything behind him, just like he used to do in his intelligence operations during the war. "Sally," Harold called out calmly, "could I have another cup of coffee, please?" His voice was friendly, as if he was having a normal breakfast, but his eyes in the mirror watched every movement the bikers made. Snake reached for Harold's shoulder, planning to spin him around. But before he could touch him, Harold spoke again. "You know," he said, still looking forward, "in about 30 seconds, some interesting things are going to happen." The bikers hesitated. Something in Harold's voice made them nervous. Snake looked around the diner, suddenly aware that Mr. Martinez had his phone out, that Big Joe was standing at the kitchen door with his heavy frying pan, and that they could hear sirens in the distance. "What do you mean, old man?" Tank asked, trying to sound tough, but not quite managing it. Harold took a sip from the fresh coffee Sally had brought him. "Well," he said, "first, those police sirens are getting closer. Second, your motorcycles are parked in a no-parking zone. I saw the sign when I drove in. And third," he paused and smiled at their reflection in the mirror, "you might want to look behind you." The 3 bikers turned around just as red and blue lights began flashing through the diner's windows. Harold hadn't just been sitting quietly all these years. He had made friends with most of the local police officers who came to Pete's Diner for breakfast. And today was Officer Wilson's regular morning to stop by. Through the diner's windows, everyone could see 2 police cars pulling into the parking lot. Their red and blue lights painted the walls of the diner in flashing colors. Snake and his friends looked worried now, but they tried to hide their fear with angry faces. "This isn't over, old man," Snake growled, but his voice shook a little. He looked at the police cars, then at the door, trying to decide what to do. His friends, Razor and Tank, were already backing away from Harold, getting ready to run. Harold kept sipping his coffee calmly. In the counter's mirror, you could see Officer Sarah Wilson stepping out of her police car. She was Mrs. Wilson's daughter, and she had grown up listening to Harold's war stories when she was little. Now she was one of the town's best police officers. Snake made a quick, angry decision. Before anyone could stop him, he grabbed Harold's veteran's cap right off his head. "Something to remember you by," he said with an ugly smile, but his smile disappeared when he saw Harold's face in the mirror. The old veteran wasn't scared or angry. Instead, he had a strange, quiet look that reminded Sally of a photograph she'd once seen of soldiers before a battle. Harold stood up slowly, his movements smooth and confident like before. "That cap," Harold said in a low voice, "was given to me by men who didn't come home from the war. Men who died so people like you could live free." He turned to face Snake, and something in his eyes made the big biker take a step back. The diner was completely silent now. Even the cooking sounds from the kitchen had stopped. Through the windows, they could see Officer Wilson and her partner walking toward the diner's door. But Snake wasn't watching them. He couldn't look away from Harold's eyes. "You boys think you're tough," Harold continued, his voice still calm, but carrying a strength that filled the whole diner. "You ride your motorcycles and scare people who can't fight back, but you don't know what tough is." Harold took one step forward. "Tough is watching your friends die on a battlefield far from home. Tough is spending months behind enemy lines, never knowing if you'll see another sunrise. Tough is coming home and building a good life after seeing the worst that people can do to each other." Snake's hands were shaking now, still holding Harold's cap. Razor had already backed up to the door, but it was too late. Officer Wilson was just outside. Tank looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. "Now," Harold said, holding out his hand, "I believe you have something that belongs to me." In that moment, Snake saw something in Harold that made him understand he had made a terrible mistake. This wasn't just some old man he could bully. This was someone who had faced real danger, real evil, and had won. The diner's door opened with a ring of its bell, and Officer Wilson stepped inside. She took one look at the scene. Harold standing straight and strong, Snake holding the veteran's cap, the spilled coffee on the floor, and she understood exactly what had happened. "Everything okay here, Mr. Thompson?" she asked, but her eyes were fixed on Snake. Her hand rested on her belt, close to her radio. Snake looked at the cap in his hands, then at Harold, then at the police officer. All his tough guy act had disappeared, replaced by the look of someone who knew he was in serious trouble. Harold smiled gently. "That depends," he said, "on whether these young men have learned anything today." He was still holding out his hand, waiting for his cap. The next few moments would decide everything, not just about the cap, but about respect, about courage, and about what it really means to be strong. Snake stood frozen, still holding Harold's veteran cap, as Officer Sarah Wilson took another step into the diner. Behind her, her partner, Officer Rodriguez, was talking into his radio, calling for backup. Through the windows, everyone could see more police cars arriving in the parking lot. "Last chance," Harold said quietly, his hand still extended. "You can give me my cap back and walk out of here with some dignity, or—" He let the sentence hang in the air, unfinished. His years in military intelligence had taught him that sometimes what people imagine can be scarier than any threat. Snake looked at the cap in his hands, then at his friends. Razor was trying to slip away toward the kitchen, but Big Joe was blocking the door with his arms crossed. Tank had backed himself into a corner, looking more like a scared cat than the tough guy he pretended to be. Officer Wilson recognized the cap in Snake's hands. She had seen Harold wearing it at every town parade, every Veterans Day ceremony, and during his visits to the local schools where he taught children about history. Her face hardened as she understood what the bikers had tried to do. "Sir," she said to Snake, her voice professional but cold, "I suggest you return Mr. Thompson's property immediately." Her hand rested casually on her belt, near her handcuffs. The message was clear. This could end easily, or it could end badly. But Snake's pride was still fighting with his common sense. His face turned red again, and his hands tightened on the cap. "Maybe I want to keep it," he said, trying to sound tough even though his voice shook. "Maybe the old man gave it to me as a gift." Harold surprised everyone by chuckling softly. "You know," he said, "in the war, we learned that sometimes the best way to win is to let your enemy think they're in control." As he spoke, he moved slightly to his left, a small step that seemed meaningless to most people watching. But this little movement put Snake exactly where Harold wanted him, between the counter and a table with limited space to move. It was a technique Harold had used many times during the war, controlling the battlefield by controlling where people could step. "What are you talking about, old man?" Snake demanded, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. Something about the way Harold moved made him nervous, though he couldn't explain why. "Just remembering," Harold said calmly. "Remembering how we used to handle tough situations. Would you like to hear about it?" Without waiting for an answer, he took another small step, and somehow Snake found himself backing up, even though Harold hadn't done anything threatening. The diner was completely silent now, everyone watching this strange dance. Harold kept talking in his gentle voice, telling a story about his war days, but with each word, he moved just a little bit. And with each movement, Snake found himself with fewer and fewer places to go. "You see," Harold continued, "sometimes the best strategy isn't to fight at all. Sometimes you just need to help your opponent realize they've already lost." As he spoke these words, Snake suddenly understood that he was trapped, the counter behind him, tables on both sides, and officers in front of him. The big biker looked down at the veteran's cap in his hands, then at Harold's calm face, and finally at Officer Wilson's stern expression. All his bullying, all his tough guy act, had led him right into a trap set by a 93-year-old man. "How?" Snake started to ask, but the word caught in his throat. How had this old veteran outmaneuvered him so easily? How had he turned from a seeming victim into someone completely in control of the situation? Harold just smiled, his hand still extended, waiting for his cap. The morning sun through the diner's windows caught the medals pinned to his jacket, making them shine like stars. The next move was Snake's, but everyone in Pete's diner already knew how this story would end. Snake looked at the veteran's cap in his hands one last time, then slowly held it out to Harold. All the toughness had drained from his face, replaced by something that looked almost like shame. But before Harold could take the cap, something unexpected happened. The diner's door burst open, and an older man in a leather jacket walked in quickly. Unlike the three bikers, his jacket was well worn and had a real military patch on it. His gray hair was cut short, and he walked with the same kind of confidence that Harold had. "What's going on here?" the new man demanded, looking at Snake with angry eyes. "I just got a call saying some of my guys were causing trouble at Pete's." He looked around the diner, taking in the whole scene, the police officers, the spilled coffee, Harold standing calmly with his hand extended. "Boss," Snake started to say, but the older biker cut him off. "Is that a veteran's cap in your hands?" the man asked, his voice getting even angrier. "Were you messing with a veteran?" He walked right up to Snake, seeming to grow taller with each step. "Did you forget everything I taught you about respect?" It turned out that the older man was Jack Thunder Thompson, no relation to Harold, the real leader of the local motorcycle club. He was a Vietnam veteran himself, and he had started the club years ago as a way to help other veterans adjust to civilian life. "Sir," Thunder said, turning to Harold and standing at attention, "I apologize for what these idiots have done. They're new members who clearly forgot our most important rule. We respect veterans always." He looked back at Snake, Razor, and Tank with disappointment in his eyes. Harold studied Thunder's face and saw the same kind of understanding there that he often saw when meeting other veterans. Without saying anything, both old soldiers nodded to each other, sharing a moment of silent recognition. "These three joined our club saying they wanted to help with our veteran support programs," Thunder explained. "But it seems they were more interested in acting tough than doing good." He held out his hand to Snake. "Give me that cap." Snake handed over the cap without a word. Thunder carefully smoothed out the fabric and presented it to Harold with both hands, showing the kind of respect one soldier gives to another. "On behalf of all real bikers," he said, "I apologize for what happened here." Harold took his cap and placed it back on his head. "No apology needed," he said with a small smile. "Sometimes young men need to learn lessons the hard way, I know I did, back in my day. Officer Wilson stepped forward. Mr. Thompson, she said to Harold, would you like to press charges? Harold looked at the three bikers, who now seemed smaller and younger than they had before. That depends, he said, turning to Thunder. What do you think would be a better lesson for them? Thunder's face turned serious. If you're willing to give them a chance, he said, I have an idea. Our club helps maintain the local veterans cemetery every weekend. These three could spend the next few months learning about real heroes while they clean headstones and plant flags. The three bikers looked surprised. They hadn't expected this kind of punishment. But when they saw both Harold and Officer Wilson nodding in agreement, they realized they were getting off easy. And, Thunder added, looking straight at Snake, they'll start by listening to some of Mr. Thompson's war stories. Maybe then they'll understand what real courage looks like. Harold's eyes twinkled as he looked at the three formerly tough bikers. Well, he said, picking up his coffee cup, I do have some interesting stories about what real bravery means. Would you boys like to hear one now? The whole diner seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The morning sun streamed through the windows, making Harold's medals shine again, as if approving of how things had turned out. 6 months had passed since that memorable morning at Pete's Diner. The place looked the same as always, the same cheerful bell above the door, the same smell of coffee and bacon in the air, but something had changed in a wonderful way. Every Thursday morning, Harold's usual table was now bigger than before. Instead of sitting alone, he was surrounded by listeners. Snake, Razor, and Tank were there, but they looked different now. Their leather jackets were clean and neat, with new patches that showed they were part of Thunder's veteran support program. They sat respectfully, leaning forward to catch every word as Harold told his stories. Tell us again about the time you had to escape from behind enemy lines. Tank would ask, his eyes wide with interest. He had become one of Harold's most eager listeners, often bringing his own young son to hear the stories too. The veterans' cemetery, where the three bikers had worked, had never looked better. Every headstone was clean and shining, fresh flowers appeared regularly, and American flags stood straight and proud beside each grave. Snake had discovered he had a talent for gardening, and he had planted beautiful flowers all around the cemetery. Mr. Thompson, Razor would say, holding his coffee cup with both hands, my grandfather was in the war too, but he never talked about it. Now I think I understand why. His voice was different now, softer, more thoughtful. The scary-looking beard was neatly trimmed, and he had started volunteering at the local veterans' hospital. Sally, the waitress, smiled as she refilled their coffee cups. She remembered how frightened everyone had been that day, and how amazed they were by Harold's calm bravery. Now, watching these former troublemakers treat the old veteran like a favorite grandfather, she couldn't help but feel proud of how things had turned out. Thunder would stop by sometimes, sitting quietly in the corner and nodding as Harold shared his wisdom. Under his guidance, the motorcycle club had become known throughout the town for their good works, especially their support of veterans. They escorted military funerals, organized fundraisers for veterans' families, and helped maintain war memorials. Officer Sarah Wilson kept a special eye on the diner during these Thursday morning gatherings, not because she worried about trouble anymore, but because she loved to see how things had changed. Her mother, Mrs. Wilson, would often join them, bringing her famous homemade cookies to share. One morning, Snake brought something special to show Harold. It was his acceptance letter to college. He had decided to study history, inspired by Harold's stories. I want to make sure these stories are never forgotten, he explained, his voice full of emotion. Someone needs to remember what real heroes did for us. Harold's veteran's cap, the one that had started all the trouble, now sat proudly on his head as always. But it had gained new meaning for everyone who knew the story. It wasn't just a piece of cloth anymore. It was a symbol of how wisdom and patience could change lives. Even Big Joe, the cook, had been touched by the change. He created a special breakfast menu item called the Veteran's Victory. Everything Harold usually ordered, served with extra respect and a side of home fries. The story of what happened that day spread through the town, growing with each telling. Some said Harold had used secret military moves to defeat the bikers. Others claimed he had hypnotized them with his war stories. But the truth was even more powerful. He had shown them what real strength looked like, and in doing so, had helped them find their better selves. As Harold sat at his table that morning, surrounded by friends who had once been enemies, he smiled and thought about how life could surprise you, even at 93. Sometimes the biggest victories didn't come from fighting at all, but from showing others a better way to live. Now, Harold said, his blue eyes twinkling as he looked at his unlikely family of listeners. Who wants to hear about the time we had to cross a river using nothing but a piece of string and an old newspaper?